All right. Yo. What's up? What's good? What's going on? Welcome to the TV. Listen, here's my chance. Wait, come on. Oh, man.
Yo, he thought he had it that time. But anyway, y'all, we gonna run down this whole entire roster for the Colorado Buffaloes so you can go put a name to a face. Without further ado, let's get into it, man, and hopefully I get them all. Starting off at quarterback, 6'3", 200-pound freshman Colton Allen out of Highlands Ranch, Colorado. Next up, defensive lineman, 6'4", 255 pounds, Taj Olson, who is a graduate student transfer from West Virginia. Next up, offensive lineman, 6'4", 295 pounds, sophomore Jackson Anderson. Next up, defensive lineman, 6'2", 240 pounds, Aaron Austin, sophomore out of Fort Worth, Texas. Next up, defensive lineman, 6'2", 290 pounds, Alan Ball, who is a sophomore out of Fort Lauderdale, Florida. Next up, cornerback, 5'11", 170 pounds, Tavion Beasley, who is a sophomore as well, transferred from Jackson State. Next up, linebacker, 6 foot, 235 pounds, Levante Bentley, who is a transfer from Clemson and a graduate student. Next up, at cornerback, 6 foot, 180 pounds, Nigel Bethel Jr., who is a senior out of Miami, Florida. Next up, wide receiver, 6'3", 210 pounds, Cole Barcia. He's a freshman out of Danville, California. Next up, offensive line, outside linebacker, 6'4", 230 pounds, freshman Shaquan Bowser out of Queen Creek, Arizona. Next up, cornerback, 5'11", 180 pounds, Kendrick Breedlove. He's a sophomore and he's out of Nashville, Tennessee. Next up, outside linebacker, 6'2", 220 pounds, sophomore, transfer from Jackson State, Jeremiah Brown. Next up, offensive lineman, 6'3", 320 pounds, Tyler Brown, who's a junior transfer out of Jackson State. Next up, tailback, 5'11", 175 pounds, Dante Capolongo, who is a freshman out of Littleton, Colorado. Next up, we've got a punter, 6'2", 245 pounds, Trent Carrizosa. He is a sophomore out of San Jose, California. Next up, we've got a quarterback, 6'3", 195 pounds, Drew Carter, who is a sophomore out of Tigard, Oregon. Next up, offensive lineman, 6'10", 315 pounds, Gerard Christian Lichtenhan. He's a junior out of Davis, California. Next up, defensive lineman, 6'3", 275 pounds, Shane Cokes. He's a graduate student and a transfer from Dartmouth University. Next up, tight end, 6'6", 240 pounds, Zach Courtney. He's a freshman out of Post, Texas. Next up, we've got safety, 6'1", 175 pounds, Austin Dalkey, sophomore out of Edgar, Wisconsin. Next up, we've got offensive lineman Camden Dempsey. He's a sophomore out of Lakewood, Colorado. Next up, we've got a defensive lineman, 6'3", 250 pounds, Jordan Dominic, who's a graduate student and a transfer from the University of Arkansas. Next up, offensive lineman, 6'6", 290 pounds, sophomore out of Spring Grove, Illinois, Luke Eckert. Next up, offensive lineman, 6'5", 280 pounds, Carter Edwards, a freshman out of Hattiesburg, Mississippi. Next up, running back, 5'9", 165 pounds, Dylan Edwards, a freshman out of Derby, Kansas. Next up, wide receiver, 6 foot, 190 pounds. He's a freshman, Sharnette Estes, out of Austin, Texas. Next up, tight end 6'5", 240 pounds, Caleb Foria, sophomore out of Attleboro, Mass, which is right down the road from me. So next up, place kicker, 6 foot, 215 pounds, sophomore Jace Feely out of Gilbert, Arizona. His father was a famous kicker in the NFL for many, many years, Jay Feely. Next up, safety, 6'2", 205 pounds, Ben Finisith, sophomore out of Durango, Colorado. Next up, outside linebacker, 6'3", 260 pounds, sophomore Devin Grant out of San Antonio, Texas. Next up, offensive tackles, 6'7", 305 pounds, freshman Travis Gray out of Aurora, Colorado. Next up, outside linebacker, 6'3", 235, Joshka Gustav. He's a junior out of Cherry Valley, California. Next up, linebacker, 6'3", 220 pounds, Nathan Hallmark. He's a freshman out of Fort Collins, Colorado. Next up, inside linebacker, 6'1", 225 pounds. He's a junior, Marvin Ham out of Belleville, Michigan. Next up, tailback, 5'9", 190 pounds, Anthony Hankerson, sophomore out of Boynton Beach, Florida. Next up, offensive tackle, 6'6", 305 pounds, Alex Harkey, a junior out of Austin, Texas. Next up, cornerback, 6 foot, 180 pounds, Simeon Harris, a sophomore out of Vallejo, California. Next up, wide receiver, 6'3", 205 pounds, Michael Harrison, a junior out of San Francisco, California. Next up, wide receiver, 5'10", 175 pounds, Jimmy Horn Jr., a junior out of Sanford, Florida, and a transfer from South Florida. Next up, punter, place kicker, 6'3", 175 pounds, Noah Hubbard. He's a sophomore out of Louisville, Colorado. Next up, cornerback / wide receiver, 6'1", 175 pounds, Travis Hunter, a sophomore, transfer from Jackson State. Next up, inside linebacker, 6'3", 230 pounds, Isaiah Hurtado, a junior out of Cypress, California. Excuse me, guys. Next up, offensive tackle, 6'6", 310, Isaiah Jada, a junior out of San Diego, California. Next up, fullback, 6'1", 250 pounds, Champion Johnson, a sophomore out of San Diego, California. Next up is his brother, linebacker, 6'4", 230 pounds, Victory Johnson, who is a freshman out of San Diego, California. Next up, cornerback, 5'10", 170 pounds, Braden Keith, freshman out of Bloomfield, Colorado. Next up, inside linebacker, 6'3", 235, Egan Carey. He's a sophomore out of Bakersfield, California. Next up, tight end, 6'4", 250, Braden Kopitz, freshman out of Portland, Oregon. Next up, wide receiver, 6'2", 190 pounds, Montana Lemonius Craig, a junior out of Inglewood, California. Next up, outside linebacker, 6'5", 230 pounds, Caden Ludwig. He's a freshman out of Happy Valley, Oregon. Next up, safety, 6 foot, 190 pounds, Jeremy Mack Jr. He is a junior out of Clinton, Mississippi, by way of East Mississippi Community College. Next up, defensive lineman, 6'3", 290 pounds, Mason Maddox, sophomore out of Aurora, Colorado. Next up, outside linebacker, 6'2", 230 pounds, Zion Magale. He's a sophomore out of Chandler, Arizona. Next up, defensive lineman, 6'4", 330 pounds. Tyus Martin, a sophomore out of Helena, Arkansas. Next up, place kicker, 5'9", 180 pounds, Alejandro Mata, who is a sophomore and a transfer from Jackson State. Next up, wide receiver, 5'9", 160 pounds, Caleb Mathis. He's a freshman out of Arlington, Texas. Next up, cornerback, 5'10", 180 pounds, Liam McGannon, a sophomore out of San Francisco, California. Next up, safety, 5'11", 190 pounds, Jaden Milner Jones, freshman, DeSoto, Texas. Next up, cornerback, 6'1", 175 pounds, Keyshawn Mills. He's a freshman out of Little Elm, Texas. Next up, offensive lineman, 6'5", 310 pounds, Yusef Mugabel. He's a sophomore transfer from the University of Florida. Next up, inside linebacker, 6'3", 225 pounds, Tommy Notarani. He is a sophomore out of San Diego, California. Next up, tailback, 5'11", 185 pounds, Charlie Alfadal. He is a sophomore out of Littleton, Colorado. Next up, we've got cornerback, 6 175 pounds, Jason Oliver Jr. And he is a sophomore out of Bakersfield, California. Next up, tight end, 6'5", 250, Eric Olson, sophomore out of Littleton, Colorado. Next up, safety, 6 195 pounds, Trey Ortega Jr. out of Broomfield, Colorado. Next up, wide receiver, 6'3", 200 pounds, Grant Page. He's a freshman out of Boulder, Colorado. Next up, place kicker, 5'9", 190 pounds, Cristiano Palazzo. He's a sophomore out of Littleton, Colorado. Next up, tight end, 6'5", 250, Luis Passarello, a sophomore out of Palo Alto, California. Next up, defensive lineman, 6'3", 310 pounds, Leonard Payne Jr. He's a graduate student and a transfer from Fresno State University. Next up, linebacker, 6'1", 225 pounds, Morgan Pearson. He's a freshman out of Ardmore, Oklahoma. Next up, long snapper, 6'1", 195 pounds, Jacob Polite, and he is a sophomore transfer from Jackson State. Next up, offensive lineman, 6'5", 290 pounds, John Ramirez. He's a freshman out of Placentia, California. Next up, cornerback, 5'10", 185 pounds, Nico Reed. He's a junior out of Oakland, California. Next up, inside linebacker, 6'3", 195 pounds, Jack Remington, a freshman out of Boulder, Colorado. Next up, offensive lineman, 6'6", 290 pounds, Ben Resnick, sophomore out of Deerfield, Illinois. Next up, wide receiver, 5'9", 180 pounds, Deuce Robinson II. He's a sophomore out of Colorado Springs, Colorado, by way of Snow College. Next up, linebacker, 6'2", 205 pounds, Caden Robertson, sophomore out of San Clemente, California, by way of Saddleback Community College. Next up, wide receiver, 6'3", 195 pounds, Ty Robinson, a junior out of Aurora, Colorado. Next up, defensive lineman, 6'2", 300 pounds, Naeem Rodman, a senior out of Lakewood, California. Next up, safety, 6'4", 220 pounds, Oki Salavea. He's out of Leone Ile, American Samoa. He is a freshman. Next up, defensive lineman, 6'6", 330 pounds, Jalen Sammy, senior out of Colorado Springs, Colorado. Next up, quarterback, 6'2", 215 pounds, Shedeur Sanders. He's a junior out of Dallas, Texas, and a transfer from Jackson State. Next up, running back, 6'2", 220 pounds, Christian Sarum, freshman, Carlsbad, California. Next up, offensive lineman, 6'7", 285 pounds, Jack Seavall, sophomore out of Centennial, Colorado. Next up, safety, 5'10", 175 pounds, Cameron Silman Craig. He's a junior and out of Cedar Hill, Texas, and a transfer from Jackson State University. Next up, defensive back, 6 foot, 195 pounds, Miles Slusher. He's a junior out of Broken Arrow, Oklahoma, and a transfer from the University of Arkansas. Next up, inside linebacker, 6'3", 225, Aubrey Smith, a sophomore out of Atlanta, Georgia. Next up, tight end, 6'5", 230 pounds, Austin Smith, a sophomore out of Edmonton, Texas. Next up, running back, 6 foot, 190 pounds, Deion Smith, senior out of Houston, Texas. Next up, safety, 6'2", 185 pounds, Xavier Smith, freshman out of Atlanta, Georgia. Wide receiver, 6'3", 200 pounds, Chase Soule. He is a freshman out of Humble, Texas. Next up, running back, 5'11", 235 pounds, Jail Stats, a junior out of Aurora, Colorado. Next up, quarterback, 6'1", 195, Ryan Staub. He's a freshman out of Stevenson Ranch, California. Next up, safety, 6'2", 185 pounds, Tyron Taylor. He's a junior out of Huntersville, North Carolina. Next up, tight end, 6'4", 210 pounds, Zico Seydou Traore. He is a junior out of London, England, transfer from Arkansas State University. Next up, wide receiver, 6'2", 185 pounds, Jordan Tyson. He is a sophomore out of Allen, Texas. Hopefully, he gets back soon from his injury. Shout out to Jordan Tyson. Jordan Tyson is a dog. Next up, defensive end, 6'4", 255 pounds, Taylor Upshaw, graduate student and transfer from the University of Michigan. Next up, punter, Mark Bassett, 6'4", 220 pounds. He's a junior out of Melbourne, Australia. Next up, running back, 5'10", 170 pounds, Victor Venn. He's a freshman out of Buford, Georgia. Next up, long snapper, 6 foot, 230 pounds, Cameron Warchuk. He's a sophomore out of Norco, California. Next up, wide receiver, 5'11", 175 pounds, Assad Wasim. He's a freshman out of Ocoee, Florida. Next up, offensive tackle, 6'8", 320 pounds, Savion Washington. He's a graduate student and transfer from Kent State University. Next up, offensive lineman, 6'2", 290 pounds. He is a sophomore out of Houston, Texas, Van Wells. Next up, cornerback, 6'1", 175 pounds, Josh Wiggins, freshman out of Spring, Texas. Next up, offensive lineman, 6'6", 310 pounds, Jake Wiley, a junior out of Centennial, Colorado. Next up, inside linebacker, 6', 250, Mr. Williams, sophomore out of Westlake Village, California. Next up, defensive lineman, 6'3", 275, Ryan Williams, sophomore out of Pearland, Texas. Next up, offensive lineman, 6'4", 310 pounds, Jack Wilty, sophomore out of Altoona, Iowa, by way of Iowa Central Community College. Next up, safety, 6'1", 200 pounds, Trevor Woods, a junior, out of Katy, Texas. And next up, we've got a safety, 6'2", 195 pounds, Jordan Wolverton, sophomore, out of Durango, Colorado. Next up, we've got Adam Hopkins, wide receiver, 6 foot, 170 pounds, out of Thomasville, Georgia. Next up, we've got wide receiver who is also coming in. He's a freshman, Omarion Miller, 6'2", 190 pounds, out of Vivian, Louisiana. Next up, edge rusher, 6'3", 245 pounds, out of Oklahoma City, Oklahoma, Taj McCoy. Next up, cornerback, 5'11", 170 pounds, out of Plano, Texas, Carter Stoutmeyer. Next up, wide receiver, 6'3", 176 pounds, out of Murfreesboro, Tennessee, Jacob Page. Next up, wide receiver, 5'10", 160 pounds, out of Fort Lauderdale, Florida, Isaiah Harge. Next up, linebacker, out of the UK, doesn't actually say here, but out of the UK, linebacker, 6'3", 220 pounds, Coffee Taylor Barracks. Next up, linebacker, 6'3", 215 pounds. I think this is his sophomore season, Demoy Kennedy, out of Theodore, Alabama. Next up, we've got sophomore wide receiver, 6'1", 165 pounds, Xavier Weaver, out of Orlando, Florida. We just picked him up, man, as a transfer from South Florida. Next up, we've got a running back, 6 foot, 215 pounds, Cavassier Smoke, out of Wetumpka, Alabama. He is a transfer from the University of Kentucky. And next up, we've got an interior offensive lineman, 6'3", 295 pounds, Landon Beebe, out of Webb City, Missouri. All right, moving on, we have a 6'2", 170 pound cornerback, out of Lakeland, Florida, Cormani McLean. He is a freshman, people. Next up, we have a safety. He is a freshman, 6'2", 190 pounds, out of Houston, Texas, Dylan Dixon. Next up, we have a wide receiver. He is 6'3", 190 pounds, out of Boulder, Colorado, Grant Page. Next up, we have Jordan Onovu. He is 6'2", 190 pounds. He's a freshman out of Santa Ana, California. Next up, we have an interior offensive lineman, 6'3", 275 pounds. He's a freshman out of Inglewood, Colorado, Hank Zalenskas. Next up, we have a sophomore, 6'4", 220 pounds. He is a transfer from the University of Iowa, Elijah Yelverton. He is a tight end, people. Next up, we have Kason Wiseman. He's 6'2", 180 pounds. He's a freshman out of Douglasville, Georgia. He is a quarterback. This guy is nice. This guy is a dual threat He's really good. I hope I didn't miss anybody, people. Thank you for tuning in. I know this was a long video, but one of my subscribers asked me to do this, and I wanted to make sure that I did it. So here you go, the entire Colorado Buffaloes 2023 roster. If I missed anybody, please let me know in the comment section, man. But I think that's everybody. Peace and blessings to all. Thanks for tuning in. Please subscribe to the channel if you haven't. Hit that bell icon. It really, really, really helps the channel grow. Peace and blessings, and I'm out.
I know you heard. You coming. You should have seen by now. Coming. Yeah, they talking about it. We coming. They doubting us. But we coming. They saying. We coming. They think it's a game. We coming. I don't give a damn what they say. You best believe. We coming. And guess what? It ain't hard to find.